Good afternoon. This is Russell Holden with RenderPlus Systems, and I want to welcome you to this introduction to IRender nXt. If you're having difficulty hearing me, it's going to be necessary to dial into this number where you'll, over the phone, participate in the audio portion of this broadcast. Otherwise, if you can hear just fine, we're all set, and we're going to get started right now. I don't assume that you have any experience with IRender nXt. Many of you visiting this webinar today have a trial version of IRender nXt installed, and so this is the perfect place to be this afternoon because I want to give you a nice introduction to the software to help you get started to creating presentation quality renderings from your SketchUp models. And in some cases, there are people who attend our webinars who are just exploring rendering software, trying to discover whether or not IRender nXt is the right rendering software for your SketchUp models. In either case, this is the place to be this afternoon. We're going to take a look at a lot of features in IRender nXt and learn how easy this software is to use. We have a number of additional resources that you might want to investigate. One of them is the RenderPlus Systems channel on YouTube. I'll be recording this video, this webinar this afternoon, and then publishing the video to the RenderPlus Systems channel. So if you need a refresher on any of the information that you've heard about this afternoon, visit RenderPlus Systems, consider bookmarking our channel, and browse on over every now and then. There's lots of nice instructional videos that you'll find and very good tips on using IRender nXt. In addition, RenderPlus Systems or RenderPlus.com is a valuable resource where you'll find tutorials, both video and written, that will help you learn how to use IRender nXt. Now, because I don't really know the kinds of models that you're making with SketchUp, I'm going to use three this afternoon. The first one that I'm going to use is a simple wooden table. We'll create some renderings of this table. The second is from the 3D warehouse, a beach cottage. And in the case of the table and the beach cottage, we haven't done anything to these models. We've loaded them from the warehouse, and then we're just going to render them. And then I created my own model because there are some things that I want to show you with IRender nXt. In particular, how to add lights to a model. That's a very important feature to understand. And then, of course, adding and managing reflections for models. We're going to cover those two subjects in considerable detail because those are very important features to understand when you're wanting to use IRender nXt to create presentation images. I want to invite you to ask questions throughout the webinar. I'll stop, answer your questions as we're going along, and if you need me to back up, that's not going to be a problem either. I'm happy to do so. The most important thing is that by the end of the webinar, I want you to be able to load a SketchUp model and then use IRender nXt to create presentation renderings. If I'm speaking too fast and I need to slow down, just type the words "too fast" as a question. I'll see that, and then that'll remind me that I'm speaking a little bit too fast and need to slow down so that I can be understood. Thanks again for joining us. I hope that you're going to learn a lot about IRender nXt, and most importantly, that by the time we're done, you're going to feel very confident about creating photorealistic renderings of your SketchUp models. If you have a trial version of IRender nXt installed, when you start SketchUp, the first thing that you'll be required to do is click the Extensions tab on the SketchUp toolbar. And when you do, you'll see IRender nXt load in the drop-down list. When you click it, our toolbar will install. Now typically this toolbar is going to install to the right of the SketchUp toolbar. I've peeled it away, which you certainly can do as well, and this helps us stay focused on IRender nXt features. In addition to our rendering programs, we also have some free extensions to SketchUp that you might find useful. One of them, when you click the paintbrush, is a materials extension. It's called the NXT library, and when you load this extension, you need to download it from our website and then install it. And when you do, you'll find that there are hundreds of additional materials that you can use with your SketchUp models. We've gone a little bit beyond just adding new materials. We've also, for each material we've added, we offer a few options on finishes. So what you'll find is that you can add a texture with a pre-selected finish to your SketchUp model. If you haven't downloaded the NXT library yet, I want to encourage you to do so. There are lots of nice textures that will help you get more out of your SketchUp models. So here's a wooden table, and this is the wooden table rendered in SketchUp, and as you can see, a wood material has been applied to this table. When the table is loaded, the first thing that you might want to do is just click Render. So no changes made to the table whatsoever. We load it from the warehouse and then we want to render it. When you click Render, this dialog appears. This is the rendering settings dialog, and across the top are 5 lighting presets. Lighting presets control the natural lighting for your model, and they are just presets. So for example, the 3 in the middle are pretty easy to understand. The first one, exterior with sun, just means that shadows are going to be created from the SketchUp sun. Interior with sun just means that the SketchUp sun is going to be used, in this case, to cast shadows and for light streaming in, natural light streaming in through any openings in your model. Interior no sun, exactly the same thing, except that the SketchUp sun will be turned off. So the 3 in the middle are very easy to understand. They are presets, so it's a very quick way for you to, based on the type of rendering that you're creating, select a preset and then render. The 2 on the outside, for example, Studio High Dynamic, is maybe not so obvious, so I thought we would use that one first, and I can give you an idea of exactly how this works. If we were to take this table to a professional photographer, the photographer would introduce lighting and all kinds of nice lighting controls around this model and then snap a photograph for us. The idea of Studio High Dynamic is exactly the same. And so when we click Start Rendering, we end up with a rendering of our table as though it had been set up in a photographer's studio. So you'll notice that there are multiple lights. You can tell by multiple shadows underneath the table on the floor. Now you'll also notice that the toolbar has changed, and that's because we're now looking at a window that is on top of the SketchUp window. This is the IRender nXt render window. And what's interesting about this window is that if we click on a material in this window, we get a pop-up menu. And from this menu, we're going to select Edit Material. That brings up this Edit Material dialog. So without having to return to SketchUp, IRender nXt in the rendering window provides us with some tools that will allow us to modify the finished rendering. So using the Edit Material dialog, we're going to click the Default tab. This gives us 9 finish presets for, in this case, the wood on this table. Now, presets means that when we click, for example, reflective, you'll notice that reflection and highlighting values have been established. So the type of finish that's going to be applied to this table is going to be a shiny metallic finish. This is going to give us a glossy finish as though we have waxed the table. Once we've modified the finish for the table, click Render, and we get this result. Now, what's really nice about using studio lighting is that we get a sample of our table of the wood in direct light. We get the sample with some filtered light, and we also get this material sampled in shadow. So we get a much more realistic rendering of our table. Then what's particularly nice about using studio lighting is that because of the light sampling that I have achieved with this rendering, this first of all is a very nice presentation graphic, but equally important is that were I to decide that I want to include this table in another model, I have a very good idea of how the wood will sample in virtually any lighting condition in my finished model. When the render window is displayed, this blue button can be really important. When we click it, we get this dialog. IRender nXt uses multiple passes on the rendering to refine lighting, to refine shading, and to refine reflections. The more passes you permit, the higher quality your rendering. Now you'll notice we actually got quite a nice rendering of our table with just 10 passes. Without returning to SketchUp, what I'm allowed to do in the IRender nXt render window is double the number of passes, and when I click OK, IRender nXt is going to resume processing this rendering. So it's going to start at pass 11 and continue. So here's pass 16, and you can see that so far, if you look at the very bottom of the screen, you'll see that pass 16 has taken 1 minute and 12 seconds to render, and then by the time finished at pass 20, this rendering took 1 minute 31 seconds, and we get more refinement in the rendering. If you'd like still more passes, the blue button gets enabled when the rendering is completed. Click it again, specify the number of passes, and then let IRender nXt continue. In this case, the rendering would be resumed starting at pass 21 and then continue. We recommend that when you first load a model, you limit the number of passes to make sure that all of the materials are displaying properly, that the lighting appears to be the way that you want it, and that everything is going to go well. Then increase the number of passes and commit your computer to a more finished rendering. This is the same table with the same lighting solution, Studio High Dynamic, and in this case, all the color has been removed. So this is the same rendering with color saturation turned down to 0. And again, this is accomplished in the IRender nXt render window. I'll show you how to do that in just a few minutes. Another option is to render the table as though it's made of white clay. So not a photorealistic rendering, but a very interesting rendering of the model just the same. This is the same rendering, but in this case rendered with just the surface colors from SketchUp. So again, not photorealistic, but a very interesting rendering of the model. The point is that IRender nXt gives you lots of options in the quality of your rendering, from photorealistic with lighting, material, finish, all the way down to lighting applied to the color surfaces in SketchUp. Here's the rendering I like. The wood surface, highly polished using Studio High Dynamic lighting, and a very good example of this wooden table rendered with IRender nXt. Now I want to move on to the next model. This is a beach cottage, and again, this model was loaded from the warehouse, and once we load it, the first thing that I like to do is create a rendering to see how I've done on building the model. Since this is a street view of the model, what I'd like to do is render this using the SketchUp sun for the shadows. So once the preset exterior with sun is selected, click Start Rendering. And again, you'll notice that we're just going to limit the number of passes to 10. I want a really quick check the model rendering. Now, when that rendering was done, I increased the number of passes to 20, and this rendering for 20 passes took 2 minutes, 6 seconds, so pretty fast. The shadows are from the SketchUp sun position. You'll notice that the sky background is just a nice clear blue sky. That's our rendering of the SketchUp sky. And you'll also notice that the windows, because they are glass, are automatically reflecting. Now, because the sky is just a blue sky, I'm just getting blue reflections in the glass. Now again, we're looking at this rendering in the IRender nXt render window. And since we're using that window, we can click on this button, which is going to offer some modifications to the completed rendering. And among them are the ability to modify the brightness of this rendering. Now, without these tools, if you wanted to modify the brightness of the rendering, you could go back to SketchUp and you could change the lighting values. You could take the completed rendering to another program altogether and modify the brightness. But we think it's pretty handy to be able to modify the brightness of the rendering from IRender nXt. So if I increase the brightness of this rendering from 50 to 60, this is now accomplished without having to start a new rendering. And once I've done this, what I notice is that I do lose some detail on the siding. The remedy is to use the sharpen filter. And so if you'll watch in just this area of my rendering, when I click sharpen, I get the detail, the contrast of this rendering restored. So now I have a brighter daylight rendering of my model, and I still have maintained very nice contrast for the material on the exterior. Another way to get to the render settings is to click on the clipboard. This is a very important set of features in IRender nXt. and you'll notice that the render settings, there are a lot of them. They're all listed on the left-hand side of this dialog. The only thing that I want to do at the moment is I want to change to another lighting preset. Remember, these are the natural lighting presets. I want to use an HDR image. Now, if you're not familiar with HDR, these are high dynamic range images. And we can use them as both the sky to illuminate the model, and we can use them as the background for the rendering. So I'm just going to select HDR sky, and I'm going to click render. And when I do, now instead of the SketchUp sky, which is just bright blue, I get lighting generated from the HDR image. A much more interesting rendering, because now instead of just blue reflected in the windows, I get clouds from this HDR image reflected. Much more realistic. Sticking with the IRender nXt render window, we also have some special effects that can be added to the model. I want to show you one really quickly. It's just haze. Now, haze is interesting because what it's going to allow me to do for my model is, my project really is just this front building, this beach cottage, and this neighboring structure is not really a part of my project. So for my presentation image, what I want to do is I want to suppress that neighboring building. Now, there are a couple of ways that we can set the limits for the haze. One of them is to just type in a value. Another is to click this arrow, and when I click it, I can then go to the render window and click on the render window. When I do that, that space or that spot is 70 feet away from where I'm standing. Now all I need to do is increase the strength of the haze, and now with haze introduced, that building is pushed back from my building. So my building pops a little bit better. So again, with special effects, just like increasing or decreasing the brightness of my rendering, adding sharpness and other filters, I'm doing all of this in the IRender nXt window. It's not necessary to go to another program altogether or to return to SketchUp in order to make adjustments to my rendering. The benefit is that IRender nXt offers several very easy to use post-processing features that you can use to modify your completed rendering. So here's the presentation rendering that I'm going to take to my client. Now again, in IRender nXt rendering, we're looking at the IRender nXt render window using the same sky background. And what I want to show you is another very important IRender nXt feature called light channels. There are 8 light channels available in the IRender nXt interface. You'll notice, for example, that light channel 0 is the sun, light channel 1 is the sky, and then I have added some artificial lights to my model. On light channel 2, I have some garden lights. On light channel 3, I have the porch light, which you can see underneath the porch. And then on light channel 4, I've got some recessed lighting. There's an overhang along here, and I've placed 3 lights underneath that overhang. Now currently, you can see that the SketchUp sun is being used for shadows on this model. When I uncheck the sun, you'll notice that the image dims a little bit and the sun shadows go away. Now let's look at the sky channel. It's currently set at 0.8. Full-on brightness of the sky would be a value of 1. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to dim the sky so that I'll have, from my rendering, an option of an evening rendering. So this time, instead of just unchecking the sky, which would turn the sky off, instead what I want to do is just dim the sky to a value of 0.2. Now I'm getting more of an evening appearance on my model. And of course, at evening, what I might want to do is turn on the other lighting, the garden lights, the porch light, and the recessed lighting. It's very important for you to understand that because the garden lights were added to the model, as well as the porch light and then the other exterior lighting, when we rendered the model, all of that lighting was calculated. But with IRender nXt, I can turn off those lighting channels and so have those lights off in the completed rendering. And then using this lighting channels dialog, I can flip those lights on. So from one completed rendering, I have a bright daylight rendering of my model. And then by manipulating lighting channels, from the same completed rendering, I can get this evening rendering of my model. I want to pause to ask if anyone has questions about the ability of IRender nXt from one completed rendering to manipulate lighting in order to create additional renderings for my presentation. Does anyone have any questions about that? I want to also point out that, sometimes there are people who attend our webinars who are using our other rendering packages, for example, Aerial Vision or 3D Design Studio. The interfaces are the same. However, there are some differences. Aerial Vision does not include the lighting channels dialog. That's an IRender nXt feature, also included in 3D Design Studio, but not included in Aerial Vision. So here's the second presentation image. I want to remind you that I loaded the beach cottage. I created a rendering using 20 passes, using an HDRI image as the background, and then I saved that as a presentation graphic. Next, I used the lighting channels interface to turn off the sun, lower the brightness of the sky, and then flip on the artificial lighting that I had added to my model. And now, from one completed rendering, I have an additional rendering that I can take to my meeting, showing an evening view of this model with the lighting. Same model, same view. The only difference is I've selected a different HDR image to illuminate the model and for the background. This HDR image is also included with IRender nXt. It's a sunset image. And so what you'll notice is that compared to the first HDR image, which is a bright daylight image, the sunset image makes a very interesting change to the model because, of course, when the sun is setting, it's more red. and that red from the setting sun warms up my rendering. So it's not just the lighting that's important, the color of the lighting is also important. And IRender nXt picks up colors from the HDR image and uses those in the rendering of materials on your model. Now I went back and I did the same thing. I modified the color of the artificial lighting so that instead of these lights being bright white, I made them look more like incandescent bulbs in the fixtures, which have more of a red hue. And so from that, I'm able to maintain this nice warm view of this beach cottage. And I think that these lighting colors are much more realistic. So again, here's the evening image with the artificial lighting white, and then the same image using the sunset HDR image, and I changed the colors of the artificial lights to more of an incandescent bulb color. So I get a completely different color scheme, if you will, for my presentation rendering. And the nice thing about IRender nXt is you decide which rendering you like better. It's very easy to create either one with IRender nXt. You have complete control over lighting and lighting colors with IRender nXt. And we're going to look at that in some detail in just a few minutes. So here is the third model. Now this is a model I created. It's a very simple interior, and I want to use this model to talk about the two most important aspects of creating a photorealistic rendering, and they are lighting and reflections. So let's start by introducing some artificial lights to this model. What you see on the screen is the SketchUp rendering of this model, which is actually quite nice, but what we'd like to do is use IRender nXt to make it even more realistic. So when I click the chandelier, I get the IRender nXt Render Ready Components dialog. Render Ready Components is a library of light fixtures that are ready to plug into the model and then immediately be used for artificial lighting. And so, for example, I've selected a round recessed lighting fixture, and I just want to point out that on this dialog, once you select the fixture, set the size, and there are really just a couple of things that you need to be concerned with. The brightness of the bulb, in this case 60 watts, the color of the light. The default is white. If you want other colors, you can specify them here. If you want to specify the lighting channel, you can do that here. I've left it at 0, which means IRender nXt will establish and set the light channel automatically for these light fixtures. They're going to go on the ceiling lights channel. Once we have these attributes set, click Create, and then attach them, in this case, to the ceiling in the model. Now I go right back to the Render Ready Components dialog, and I select from the warehouse some interior sconces, and again, set the brightness of these light fixtures, set the color, and then place them. So I'm just using these to light these pictures on the wall. And then right back to the same dialog. And in this case, I just want to place a desk lamp on my shelf. Now, in placing the ceiling lights and in placing the sconces, I had multiple selected, but I really only need one desk lamp. So I'm going to switch to placing a single, and then you can see I have the desk lamp now placed on my shelf. And at this point, we're ready to render our model. So we click Render. In this case, this is an interior rendering, and I do want to use the SketchUp Suns because I have a window in my room. And so here we have a very nice rendering of this interior with natural light, the sunlight coming through the window, and artificial light from the ceiling lights that we've added, the sconces on the wall, and of course the desk lamp. And now what I'd like to do is I'd like to pay attention to the details of the materials in this rendering to make it much more realistic, so that I get a rendering more like this, with nice reflections on the floor, with the table, instead of just being transparent, behaving more like glass. And so I'd like to spend some time to talk about adding this level of detail to the model by modifying the SketchUp materials. Now first, let's review again the idea of the material finish presets that are available with IRender nXt. By default, if we haven't established a finish for a material, the materials are going to be rendered using a matte finish. That's what's being used right now with this lamp. And what that means is, you can see the intensity of the reflection and highlighting is set to 0. That's what the matte preset will do. I thought it might be helpful to show you this diagram that illustrates a reflection and highlighting intensity of 0 all the way over here on the left, in which case the light is reflected off of the material, but nothing else. All the way to the other extreme of an intensity and highlight value of 0.9, much more mirror-like, and then of course variations of the reflection in between. So you have excellent control over how reflective the material is. Plastic renders the lamp in this way, and you can see that the intensity of the reflection and highlight is relatively low, as well as the sharpness of the reflection. So I do get better than matte, and it does make this lamp look as though it's just an inexpensive plastic lamp. Now that's all achieved by just clicking plastic. So when I click plastic, it's very much like the natural lighting presets. When I click plastic, the values for intensity and sharpness are set for me. All I need to do is render. Similarly, if I click metal, the intensity and highlight values are preset for me, and I get now kind of a brass looking finish on my lamp. So I get to decide, is my lamp made of plastic? Is it made of metal? And most of the time, what you'll discover is selecting a preset from this menu gives you exactly the finish that you're after on the material. At the same time, you can also start with the preset and then adjust the values to make the material look exactly the way that you want it to look in your rendering. For example, if I click glossy, this is the result that I get. So this is a completely different type of finish on this metal lamp. In this case, I'm not getting a mirror-like reflection. Glossy emphasizes highlighting. So I'm getting highlighting from the artificial and natural lighting in the room, but no true reflections of the environment around this lamp. If I remove metallic, here's the difference. Now the difference is pretty subtle, but it's important. When metallic is checked, the reflection of, the highlighting is in the color of the metal. When metallic is unchecked, the highlighting is in the color of the light. Now all my lights are relatively white. And so with glossy checked, metallic unchecked, I get highlighting in the color of the light. Now I returned this to the brass finish, which is what I really wanted in my model. So this is a metallic finish and using the default values. Then what I did was I looked at this lamp from another angle and I noticed that it's actually quite nice when it's really, really shiny and highly polished. In this example, I lowered the sharpness of the reflection to make the lamp look less polished. So I started with the metallic preset, an intensity of 0.9 for reflection and highlighting, and a sharpness value of 1, which makes this metal very polished. And then I decided that I wanted to see this lamp also not quite so polished, so I lowered the sharpness value to 0.6. Again, very important for you to understand that most of the time, selecting a preset is perfect for the rendering. But as the model builder, you have complete control over the finish to either lower values or bump them up to give you exactly the finish on the material that you're after. And our dialogues make it very easy to control the finishes. Now this isn't specifically a reflections issue, but the brick wall in this rendering, it's very nicely rendered, but it's a little bit flat. On the Edit Material dialog, you'll also find some texture options, and one of them is called Auto Bumping. And when you use Auto Bump on a brick wall and click OK and then Render, you get a little bit better 3D relief on the textured wall. It's very important when you're trying to create a photorealistic rendering to pay attention to the details of the materials. So for example, this wooden chair, it's pretty nicely rendered, but I believe we can improve it. And so, again, I click on the wood and I get the Edit Material dialog. Now in this case, all I'm going to do is set the intensity of the reflection and highlighting to a value of 1, and then I'm going to lower the sharpness down to 0.4. So I want very good reflections, but I want them to be very fuzzy. And I get this very nice finish on this chair. Now this is an example of if you're comfortable with the settings and you have a pretty good grasp of intensity and sharpness, you can always start with one of the presets, it's a very good idea. However, it's not necessary. You can just jump straight away to setting an intensity and a sharpness value, and you'll get very nice renderings. Now, when I rendered the model, I thought, you know, these images, framed images on the wall were pretty nice, but if this really was artwork that I cared about, I might decide to place it under glass. And so I added glass and then re-rendered, giving me some nice reflections over these paintings. Now that was pretty easy to do because all I did was in SketchUp added another surface, and then with IRender nXt in SketchUp defined these new surfaces as glass, and then I just rendered. That's all I had to do. Let's talk about glass for a minute. If I click on this tabletop, again, I get this edit material dialog, and we're becoming increasingly familiar with this dialog. One of the options for glass is thick glass. Now, thick glass is kind of nice because it gives me the ability to establish the refraction value through the glass. The default, by the way, is 1.5. I actually bumped it up to 2.45 because my glass for this table is pretty thick. It's about a ½ inch thick, a nice heavy piece of glass. So I knew that with that thick glass, the refraction would be greater than the default value in IRender nXt. So here is thick glass rendered with a refraction of 2.45. I'm going to back up and show you. You see how the edge of that area rug moves? So here is the tabletop rendered as just a translucent surface. Here it is rendered as glass. And look at the way the carpet shifts when IRender nXt refracts the light through the glass. Very realistic rendering of thick glass. Next, the floor material is a very nice light colored floor, but I need some reflections, and I don't want this floor to look as though it's highly polished like a bowling alley floor. I wanted it to have more of a matte type of finish, but still good reflections of lighting. And so I set intensity to 0.6 and I set sharpness to 0.4. And I get really nice fuzzy reflections of the lighting in the glass. Next, I wanted to change the finish on the vase of flowers. And so the vase, I just clicked the metal preset. And if you remember, then I get, on reflection and highlighting, I get metallic checked automatically, an intensity of 0.9, very high intensity of reflection, and a sharpness of 1, so pretty much mirror-like in the way that things will be reflected. But then I wanted to make this somewhat transparent. So I set a very low transparent value of 0.10. And now look at what I get. I get this beautiful vase that I can only kind of see through. Exactly the finish that I was after. Started with the preset, and then the only thing that I modified was the transparency value. And I made it not very transparent at all, just 10% transparent. Next is that column, which is a painted column with just a matte paint. And so what I want to do is I want to make the paint look a little bit more glossy. So in this case, I'm setting the reflection and highlighting to glossy. That means that lights are going to be reflected in the color of the light, and I set the intensity to 0.6 and the sharpness to 0.45. So I'm going to get nice fuzzy reflections on this column. Now when I render my rendering, when I complete the rendering, let's look at the differences. So the lamp now, instead of being a matte finish, is very glossy, very shiny. I'm getting nice reflections in the floor, and I'm getting very fuzzy reflections of the light, which is exactly what I was after. Kind of a nice satin finish on this floor, not quite so mirror-like. My vase renders beautifully. I've got a nice thick glass table. I'm getting good highlighting on my column. And I put, if you remember, I put glass in front of my pictures. This attention to detail makes quite a difference from no reflections but good lighting to lots of very nice reflections in my model. And I hope you'll agree that in all cases, the interface with IRender nXt made it very easy to modify materials in the SketchUp model to achieve these reflections and increase the realism in the completed rendering. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about the importance of the number of passes in using IRender nXt. This is another slight variation of the model, and this is the model after 5 passes. Now you'll notice the floor in particular, that after just 5 passes, I'm actually getting kind of a mirror-like reflection. And so if you're impatient or you're not sure of what's going on, you may be inclined to make some adjustments. But actually, I want to tell you, don't do that. This rendering just needs more passes to achieve that satin finish on the floor that I'm after and to refine all of the lighting going on in this model. So here's the same model after 10 passes. Now, the reflections are still kind of mirror-like, but you can see they are getting fuzzier. Here's the same after 20. Everything improving quite a lot at 20 passes. Here's 50 passes. Look at the floor. The reflections are getting fuzzier still. I'm getting more and more of that satin finish that I'm after. The lighting on the ceiling is much more refined. And now, at this angle, notice how textured, by just using auto bump, notice how textured my brick wall looks. And now, here we are at 100 passes. You know, for a lot of people, this actually might be the rendering that they're after. And this rendering didn't take very long at all. But how about if we just keep going? Here's this rendering after 1,000 passes. Now, 1,000 passes, in all fairness, did take several hours. But for the type of rendering that I want to present to my client, it's absolutely worth it. Because look at the floor now, this beautiful satin finish on this floor. All of the reflections are much more refined, and the lighting solution is absolutely beautiful. I did one other thing that I want to show you. You'll notice after I actually ran this for 1,000 passes, I noticed that I'd kind of forgotten about my really nice Eames chair. These chairs, when you buy them, are usually delivered with leather. Now, unfortunately, in the first time I created this rendering, it looks like, to me, it looks more like fabric, not leather. So I went back with IRender nXt, and I modified the finish of this black material, and I gave it an intensity of 0.5 and a sharpness of 0.4. And then I re-rendered the model, and now I think you'll agree this is now very convincing as leather, which is how these expensive Eames chairs are designed, built, and delivered. You have a lot of options for the types of renderings that you can do with IRender nXt, and one of them that I wanted to mention, I think it's kind of underused in IRender nXt, is the ability to create a panoramic image. Now I'm making a very big image, 4,000 pixels by 2,000 pixels. And just like the number of passes, you'll notice that the higher resolution the image, the longer the rendering is going to take to complete. Generally, the number of passes is way more important than the resolution. But in the case of panoramic images, you'll really want to create a nice high resolution image. So when I do, this was actually, by the way, created with just 20 passes, and it's a very nice panoramic image. But because it was high resolution, 4,000 by 2,000 pixels, this did take several hours to generate. But the benefit is that there is a very nice free viewer available for download. We give you the link on our website. It's the one that I use, and when I use it, I get a very nice ability to dynamically pan around this model. Now, I'm not showing you that live in the webinar because the refresh rate wouldn't really work properly. And so instead, I just took a couple of snapshots of this panorama. I love panoramic images, and IRender nXt does a spectacular job of creating very nice panoramic images of the model. Now, the benefit is that even though this rendering took several hours to create, I can once again, from one completed rendering, get several very nice presentation images. And I got to tell you, clients love panoramic images. So install the viewer, take it with you to a meeting, and show your clients a nice panoramic image of their model. I do hope that this introduction to IRender nXt has helped you understand that our interface makes creating high-end photorealistic renderings from your SketchUp models very easy to achieve. You know, with a lot of renderers, things like artificial lighting and reflections can be kind of complicated and difficult to understand. At RenderPlus Systems, what we strive to do is to make these options for your renderings very easy to understand and to make all of the settings that you need in order to control these rendering options as accessible as possible. Now, I've recorded this webinar. I'm going to be uploading it in the next hour or so. I'll upload it to our YouTube channel. If you have any questions that occur to you that you'd like to have answered, please send them to support@renderplus.com. I'll be happy to answer them. If you have any questions that arise as you're using your trial version of IRender nXt, again, use our resources, our RenderPlus Systems channel on YouTube. Visit renderplus.com, take a look at the tutorials, and look at our online documentation for IRender nXt. It's comprehensive, very easy to understand, and absolutely developed to help you get the most out of IRender nXt. Thanks very much for attending this webinar. I look forward to seeing you at another one. Check back on our website, renderplus.com, where we list our upcoming webinar schedule. There are some topics that I'm certain down the road will be of interest to you. So again, thanks very much for attending. Let's go get some renderings done.